reality is that slavery reparations per se are completely unworkable. Even big advocates of it, like Ta-Nehisi Coates, have failed to come up with any actual metric for how exactly we'd go about doing that. What do you do with, for example, Barack Obama, whose father was black and not from the United States, and therefore not having a history with slavery, and a mother who is white? Would his family receive slavery reparations? How about Kamala Harris, whose father is Jamaican and mother is Indian? Does she receive slavery reparations? From whom? Does she receive slavery reparations from me? My great-grandparents got here in 1907, long after slavery was over, and lived their entire lives in the North, where Jim Crow was not in effect. It's almost impossible. I think not almost. It is impossible to come up with a fair metric for recompensing slavery. Yeah. 10 generations after
entitlement, essentially. And when you look at, the amount of money in America that is going to entitlements, you go back to 2008, $430 billion. In 2020, the projected is almost double, $807 billion. So it begs the question, if you continue to throw more money at the problem, what exactly does it solve necessarily?
Well, this is exactly right. I mean, the war on poverty, which was launched in part to rectify a lot of the racial imbalances and evils that had been happening in the country, been manifest in America. We've spent tens of trillions of dollars in the war on poverty, and there's been no actual real receipt from that as far as the number of black people who have been raised from poverty by the war on poverty. Again, if you go back to the war on poverty, at that time, 20% of all black children were born into single mother families. Now it's upward of 70%. The black poverty rate is essentially the same now as it was back in 1970. That does not suggest that throwing money at the problem is a cure for whatever historic ailments have been exhibited on the black community. And not just that, the reality is that we now live in a time where legalized discrimination is not only illegal, but it is, for good reason, looked down upon, sneered at by virtually all Americans. And that means that the vast majority of decisions are in the hands of individuals. If we actually want people to rise in society of any race, what we need to be doing now is focusing on making sure the incentives are aligned so that people make the right decisions to bring themselves up out of poverty. Throwing money at the problem is not slavery reparations. In many cases, it is a way of ensuring that people have an incentive not to make the right decisions.
it's more that blame whitey movement, mania, madness, and it's sheer racial rhetoric. And that's what you get at the Al Sharpton so-called House of Justice. You have buffoonery, and you have diversion, you have distraction, you have this notion of farce. So at that House of so-called Justice, you have either a horror picture show showing, or you have a farce. Either way, it is not to be taken seriously. I can't understand how serious presidential contenders can give legitimacy to a racial blowhard. And I think it is outrageous and silly and idiocy on the part of the presidential candidates. And anybody who thinks that white Americans are going to take the blame or going to feel guilty or give their land and their property away in some sort of reparations pot because they feel responsibility for the sins of their forebears. They're not.
Tried to deal with our original sin of slavery by fighting a civil war, by passing landmark civil rights legislation. We've elected an African-American president.
Mitch McConnell went on to reference the fact that no one currently alive was responsible for slavery, and he said it would be hard to determine who exactly to pay reparations to.
The ugly part of human history is that slavery has been a part of it from the very beginning. It's only been in the last 10,000 years or so that the idea of slavery has been reconsidered, and the reconsideration occurred in the West. Asians enslaved Asians, Caucasians enslaved Caucasians, Native Americans, or what we call Native Americans, enslaved Native Americans, blacks enslaved blacks. Here's the other problem. We're assuming that the major problems facing the black community are a legacy of slavery. Where's your proof? The number one problem facing the black community is the absence of fathers. And 100 years ago, only about 20-25% of black kids were born outside of wedlock. In some places, in some cities, census reports suggest that a black kid was slightly more likely to be born to a mother and father married than a white kid. Now that number is almost 70%. Unless you're prepared to say racism is bigger now than it was 100 years ago, you cannot pin that on slavery.